Deuteronomy is the last book of the Pentateuch, or Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and winds up the event of the Israelites' exodus from Egypt, which we believe took place sometime in the 13th century BCE, before Common Era. We believe the original text of Deuteronomy was written in the 7th century BCE. And what we heard today, is an addition to the original text, probably written in the 6th century BCE, so maybe even 100 years later than the original text. What is written is attributed to Moses, a last sermon of sorts, to instill hope in the nation of Israel that was so desperately needed. In the original story of the Exodus, Moses leads the Israelites through the wilderness for 40 years, but he himself is not the one to carry them over the Jordan into the land promised to them. Joshua is the one who leads them into that land. They were poised for greatness on the plains of Moab, destined to be a nation that thrived in the land given to them by God through the covenant made at Mount Horeb. Now, as this speech of Moses is added, the current Israelites, the 6th century BCE Israelites, face a similar decision as their ancestors did. Poised to return to their land from exile, Moses here is getting them ready, just as he did after the 40 years in the wilderness. And he says, I set before you 2 things today, life and prosperity, or death and adversity. The choice is pretty simple, if you ask me. Choose to accept God, and you will have abundant life in the new land you are to possess, or in this case, repossess. Reject God, and you will not fare so well. Choose the good. Choose God, and you will live and thrive. Paul doesn't so much set a choice before the Corinthians, but Paul, made the choice himself to feed them milk instead of solid food because he knew they were not ready. Paul confronts them. He says, don't think so highly of yourselves. You are not of the Spirit, you are of the flesh, mere babies in the faith. You are not as mature as you think you are. So I choose to feed you with milk and not solid food. And this first section is about growth as in maturity, maturing from a baby to someone mature in the faith, such as Paul and Apollos. Paul says you are of the flesh because you continue to bicker and quarrel. Stop this, he says. He literally says, stop doing this and grow up. Grow up, so that you can mature and grow into a community of believers. Then his focus shifts to growth in an agricultural sense. He says, I planted the seed, Apollos watered, but it was God who gave the growth. God grew you and all who are children of God. And God will continue to work in you so that you are of the Spirit. But you have to become that mature believer in faith. Growth is at the heart of Jesus' message to the disciples as well, as he continues to teach them in his Sermon on the Mount. Jesus wants the disciples to grow in their faith, mature in their faith. And he wants us to grow as well in ours. And he gives them today what we call the 6 antitheses. You all knew that, right? Just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? The 6 antitheses. 3 of them on righteousness, which we hear today, and 3 on the disciples' application of these antitheses, of which we only hear the first one today. Normally, next week we'd hear the rest of it, the other 2, but because next week is the last Sunday of Epiphany, we'll skip all that, and we'll just go to the readings for that day. So you'll have to read them on your own. What is an antithesis, you might ask? Well, it's when Jesus says, you have heard it said, and he continues, whatever that may be, but I say this, right? We get that language. We're familiar with it. We've heard it before. And then he goes on to explain the vicious cycle that we can get caught up in by doing these things. And then what we might do to prevent it, though it seems a bit far-fetched. And what do I mean by that? Well, hold on. I'll try to explain in a minute. Think back to some of what we heard last week in the readings and today in the reading from Deuteronomy. If you choose to follow the commands I have given you. We heard that last week. We heard that the week before. If you choose to follow the commands I, God, give you, then good things will happen. Think of the 10 Commandments. Remember, they are about right relationships to God and to one another, that is, our neighbor. Today, in the antitheses, we hear Jesus is actually talking about love and how through love we create these right relationships. Now, I know all of you are thinking, I didn't get love out of that gospel reading. Well, that's what it is. These teachings on love include the love of God to us and to one another, the love that shows no hostility or anger, that love is not predatory when Jesus talks about lust, that there is love in marriage, and his talk on divorce, which is really an extension of his talk on adultery, that love is unconditionally truthful when he talks about swearing oaths. Again, you might have heard this when Barbara read it and thought it had nothing to do with love, which I get, but think about it. If we truly love, then there is no need for anger among us. No need to be unfaithful or to write someone off or to swear by someone or something to show that we are being truthful. Just tell the truth. That's the point. Now, I do have to say, we live in a world where divorce is a reality, and there are legitimate reasons for divorce, especially when there are situations of abuse. This is not a commentary on why one should or shouldn't get divorced. I want you to hear that. Jesus' point here is that divorce was first allowed out of frustration for how people treated one another. A man was allowed to write a certificate of divorce and literally write off his wife. And this certificate was important because it was what legally allowed the woman to be cared for. Jesus is speaking to the hard-heartedness of people who are not showing love. Again, unfaithfulness is the exception in this case, but there are today other legitimate reasons for the health and safety of the people involved. So I want to make that known. Jesus is teaching on the importance of love, but he gives some solutions that seem unreasonable, like leaving in the middle of a ritual ceremony to make amends with your fellow human, or tearing out your eye or cutting off your hand. You are probably not going to do these things. But the point is, don't let anger get the best of you. Don't let lust pull you in. Love one another. Work out those differences. Work out your issues so that it doesn't come to that. It's about making choices. How we live our lives is about making choices, and how we grow depends on those choices we make. We can choose to be righteous, caring for and respecting our fellow human beings and all of creation. We can choose to be faithful to God and to one another. We can choose to love ourselves and our neighbor. And we can and we will choose the chiefs. Amen.